What if the history books gave you the captain's story, but buried the crew's? What if the most important account of the most consequential voyage in the Western world was never written by the man standing at the bow, scanning the horizon for glory, but by the men behind him, hauling rope in the dark, wondering if they were going to die? There are documents that history almost lost. Personal accounts, fragments of testimony, the preserved words of ordinary sailors who crossed the Atlantic in 1492 aboard 3 ships barely larger than the boats you might see drifting through a harbour on a Sunday day afternoon. Men who recorded what they saw, what they feared, what they were never supposed to say. Men whose voices were quietly folded into the archive of the forgotten, beneath the official record, beneath the monument and the myth and the marble statue pointing westward into legend. Tonight, we open those files. Get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. If you're lying in the dark somewhere, let the weight of the mattress hold you. Let the sounds of wherever you are, the hum of a fan, the distant murmur of a street, the quiet of a house settling into itself, become the background to a story that has been waiting 500 years to be told at the proper pace. There is no urgency here, no rush toward the ending. The archive opens slowly, the way old documents unfold when you handle them carefully, the way ink that has been waiting centuries to be read finally gives up its meaning to someone patient enough to sit with it in the quiet. Before we go further, if you enjoy stories where history refuses to make sense, where the official record turns out to be only the surface of something much deeper, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you're listening in the dark somewhere tonight, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I want to imagine this silence stretching across the world. Tokyo at dawn, London at midnight, Sao Paulo on a lunch break. All of us listening to the same story, separated by oceans and time zones. But somehow, all here together in the archive. Now, August 1492. The harbour of Palos de la Frontera in southern Andalusia. The sun has gone down, and the air along the Tinto River is thick with salt and mud and the sharp smell of tar. Torches flicker on wooden piers, throwing unsteady light across dark water. 3 small ships lie moored in the estuary, their masts swaying gently with the tide. The creak of timber on rope, the slap of water against hulls, and somewhere in the shadows along the wharf, the low murmur of nervous men. Tomorrow morning, roughly 90 sailors, officers, and anxious volunteers will board those ships and sail west into an ocean that no European has ever crossed and return to tell about. They don't know what's out there. They don't know if they'll ever see Spain again. And tonight, on the last solid ground they'll stand on for weeks, maybe months. Some of them are already keeping secrets, not from the ocean, from history, because the story we were given, the story of Columbus the visionary, the discoverer, the man who changed the world, is a story told from the top of the hierarchy downward. It is the captain's story, the crown's story, the story of men who had something to gain from how the voyage was remembered. It is a story shaped by power, by the need to justify an enormous investment of royal resources, by the political necessity of presenting a unified and triumphant account to the courts of Europe. It is a story that was edited before it was ever written down, because the man writing it knew that what he wrote would be read by kings. But 90 men made that crossing, 90 human beings, each with a body that felt fear and hunger and exhaustion, each with a mind that formed its own impressions of what was happening, each with reasons, private, complicated, sometimes desperate reasons for being on those ships at all. And a handful of them wrote things down, or spoke things aloud that others recorded, or left behind fragments of testimony preserved in legal disputes and church records and the margins of official documents that tell a different story than the one we learned in school. That is the archive we're opening tonight. Not the monument, the margin. Not the captain's log, the sailor's whisper. Let's begin where they began, on the last night before the unknown, in a small Andalusian harbour that smelled like fish and tar and fear. The 3 ships were shockingly small. This is the first thing you need to understand, because until you feel the scale of them in your imagination, the rest of the story doesn't quite land with its full weight. We have been trained by centuries of retrospective grandeur to imagine the 1492 voyage in terms proportional to its consequences, to picture great galleons with billowing sails towering above the water, built for the scale of the history they were about to make. The reality was something else entirely, something humbler, and in its humility, something more remarkable. The Santa Maria, the flagship, was a carrack, what the Spanish called a nayo, a small merchant vessel of roughly 100 to 110 tons burden, with a hull length of perhaps 19 meters. To give you some sense of what that means, that is roughly the length of a modern school bus. 4 sedan cars parked end to end. The entire ship, bow to stern, would fit comfortably inside a modest apartment building's lobby, and this was the largest of the 3. The Nina and the Pinta were caravels, smaller and lighter still. The Nina perhaps 50 to 60 tons, her deck length around 15 meters, about the size of a 40-foot sailboat you might see moored at a marina on a summer afternoon. The kind of boat a wealthy family takes out on weekends. The Pinta slightly larger, perhaps 17 meters on deck. If you stood at the bow of either vessel and looked back toward the stern, you could probably throw a stone and hit the tiller. You could shout at a normal conversational volume and be heard clearly from one end of the ship to the other. These weren't ships in the way we imagine ships. They were tiny wooden platforms, organic and flexible, always moving, always making noise, perpetually damp, perpetually cramped. The Santa Maria had a raised forecastle at the bow and a taller stern castle at the stern, 3 masts, the fore and main rigged with square sails, the mizzen carrying a triangular lateen sail. She had a few small cabins tucked into the stern castle for officers and a cramped hold below the main deck for provisions, water casks, trade goods, spare canvas, and coiled rope. The caravels were different, lower, sleeker, more open, with almost no enclosed space below deck. Most of the ordinary sailors lived, ate, and slept on the open main deck in all weather. No cabins, no bunks, no privacy, just a square of damp planking and whatever piece of canvas or wool blanket you could claim as your own. Now imagine filling those tiny wooden worlds with 90 men. 90 human beings, each with their own fears, their own reasons for being there, crammed together for weeks with nowhere to go and no way out except forward into the unknown or backward across the same terrifying emptiness they had just crossed. 90 men sharing the air, sharing the water rations, sharing the particular silence that falls over a group of people who are all thinking the same frightening thought, but have agreed, without quite saying so, not to say it out loud. They weren't a random collection of dreamers and desperados, though later stories sometimes paint them that way. Most were experienced seamen from the coastal towns clustered around the mouth of the Rio Tinto, Palos, Moguer, Huelva, places where the ocean wasn't an abstraction or an adventure. It was work. These were fishing communities, trading ports, towns where boys grew up on boats and men earned their living hauling nets or piloting cargo vessels down the African coast. They knew wind and tide. They knew how to read weather in the colour of the sky at dawn. They knew when to reef a sail and when to ride out a blow. They knew the ocean the way a carpenter knows wood, not romantically, but practically, with the specific and hard-won knowledge of people who depend on a thing for their survival. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was whether the ocean sea had an end or whether sailing west would carry them past the edge of the known world into something they had no language for. The old fear of a flat earth ending in a waterfall is largely a myth invented by later centuries, but the real fears were no less serious. There were theories about calms so permanent that a ship could never escape them. There were stories of magnetic islands that would pull the iron nails from a hull and leave the planking to fall apart in the water. There were the simple, practical fears of men who understood the sea well enough to know exactly how many things could go wrong and who were about to sail farther from any known shore than any European sailor in recorded or recorded memory. But they went anyway, and some of them, in the days and weeks that followed, wrote down what it was actually like. The documents we're drawing on tonight come from several sources. There is the abstract of Columbus's own journal, preserved through the transcription of Bartolomé de las Casas, a document that is itself a kind of palimpsest, a copy of a copy, filtered through the perspective of a man who had his own agenda, his own vision of what the voyage meant, his own reasons for emphasizing certain details and passing over others. Las Casas was a priest and a reformer, a man who would later become one of the most passionate critics of Spanish colonial violence, and his transcription of Columbus's log is coloured by his own complex relationship to the story it tells. We are reading Columbus through Las Casas, which means we are reading one man's version of another man's version of events. There are the later testimonies collected during the Pleitos Colombinos, the Columbus lawsuits, a decades-long series of legal disputes between Columbus's heirs and the Spanish crown, during which dozens of surviving crew members and witnesses were called to give sworn depositions about what had actually happened at sea. These depositions, taken between roughly 1512 and 1536, represent some of the most extraordinary primary source material in the history of exploration. Old men, some of them in their 60s and 70s by the time they were called to testify, reaching back across decades to remember what they had seen and heard and done on those 3 small ships. Their memories are imperfect, inevitably. They contradict each other in places. They are shaped by the legal questions being asked and by the political stakes of the dispute, but they are also, in their imperfection, irreplaceable. They are the closest thing we have to the sailors' own voices. There are the letters and accounts of Pedro de Terreros, Columbus's steward, and fragments attributed to various officers. There are the observations preserved in the writings of Michele de Cuneo, an Italian nobleman who sailed on a later voyage but recorded conversations with men who had made the first crossing. And there are the marginalia, the notes in the margins of official documents, the afterthoughts, the corrections, the small rebellions of men who wanted the record to reflect something the official version had smoothed away. Small penciled additions, words crossed out and replaced, dates corrected, distances disputed. The archive of disagreement that accumulates in the margins of any document that someone has read carefully and found wanting. Taken together, these fragments form something that is not quite a diary and not quite a confession, but something in between. A collective memory, imperfect and partial, of what it actually felt like to be one of those 90 men sailing west into the impossible. Let's start with the first secret the sailors kept, the one that nearly ended the voyage before it had properly begun. Columbus lied to his crew about how far they had traveled. This is documented. It is not speculation. It is one of the most quietly remarkable details in the entire history of the voyage, and it tells us something important about the relationship between the man at the top of the hierarchy and the men below him. A relationship built from the very beginning on a carefully managed version of the truth. Columbus kept two reckonings of the ship's progress. The first was the real one, as accurate as 15th century dead reckoning could be. His best estimate of how many leagues they had sailed each day, calculated from the ship's speed, the compass heading, and the time elapsed. The second was a shorter figure, a deliberately reduced count, which he announced to the crew each day as the official distance travelled. His reasoning, as he recorded it himself, was straightforward. He was afraid that if the men knew how far they had come from Spain, how many hundreds of leagues of empty ocean now lay behind them, they would panic. They would lose heart. They would demand to turn back. He was managing their fear the way a navigator manages a difficult crossing, not by eliminating the danger, but by controlling how much of it the crew could see at any given moment. He was rationing the truth the way Pedro de Toreros rationed the hardtack, carefully, with an eye on the long voyage ahead. So he told them they had travelled less than they had. He gave them a smaller ocean to be afraid of. And here is the strange irony that Columbus himself noted in his journal, the detail that has fascinated historians for centuries. His false reduced reckoning turned out to be more accurate than his real one. Because Columbus consistently overestimated the ship's speed, a common error in dead reckoning, where you tend to be optimistic about your progress, his true reckoning was actually too large. The smaller number, he told the crew, was, in a roundabout way, closer to the actual distance travelled. The lie, it turned out, was more truthful than the truth. But the crew didn't know that. What they knew was that they were being managed, and some of them suspected it. The more experienced pilots among them, men who had spent years developing their own feel for a ship's speed, their own intuitive sense of how far a vessel had come in a given time, were running their own calculations. Quietly, without making a formal challenge, they were keeping their own numbers. And the numbers didn't always match what Columbus announced from the stern castle each evening. The testimonies from the Pleitos Colombinos, those legal depositions taken decades later when old men were asked to remember what they had seen and heard in 1492, contain hints of this suspicion, whispered between men on night watch, murmured in the cramped darkness below the main deck. There was a sense, articulated in fragments by several witnesses, that Columbus knew more than he was saying, that the distances he announced didn't quite match what the more experienced pilots were calculating on their own. that the man in the stern castle had a plan he wasn't fully sharing, that the voyage was being steered not just by compass and wind, but by a private knowledge that the commander was keeping close. This wasn't paranoia, it was observation, and it would become the seed of something much more dangerous as the weeks wore on. But before we reach the near mutiny, and we will reach it, because it happened, and the accounts of it are remarkable, we need to spend some time in the ordinary hours of the voyage. Because the crisis, when it came, grew out of the accumulation of ordinary discomfort. It grew out of weeks of bad food and broken sleep and the particular psychological weight of a horizon that never changes. The ocean, day after day, looked exactly the same flat line in every direction, the same color of water, the same quality of light, the same wind from the northeast, reliable and relentless, pushing them west. And beneath the sameness, the growing, unspoken awareness that every mile west was another mile they would eventually have to cross again on the way home, if there was a way home. What did it actually feel like, day after day, to sail west on those ships? The routine of a 15th century vessel was organized around the watch system, 4-hour shifts that divided the day and night into segments, each governed by the turning of a half-hour glass, a small sand glass that had to be manually flipped by a ship's boy every 30 minutes. The groomit, the ship's boys, were responsible for this. They were also responsible for announcing the time, often with a short sung verse, a kind of chant that marked the passage of the hours. Imagine lying on the open deck in the dark, trying to sleep, and hearing that small voice every half hour, singing out the time into the Atlantic night. It would have been both comforting and relentless, a human sound in all that inhuman emptiness, a reminder that civilization, however fragile, was still present. A child's voice in the dark, counting out the minutes of an ocean crossing, measuring the distance between Spain and the unknown in half-hour increments. The food was what you might expect from a 15th century ocean crossing, which is to say, grim, and getting grimmer as the weeks passed. The provisions loaded at Palace were the standard stores for a voyage of uncertain length. Hardtack, biscuit baked twice to remove all moisture, dense and dry, capable of surviving months at sea, but also capable of harbouring weevils in its hollow interior, which you learned to tap out before eating or, eventually, stopped bothering to tap out at all. Salted fish, primarily cod and sardines, salted and dried meat, dried peas, lentils, chickpeas, olive oil stored in ceramic amphora, wine and vinegar, in casks, some honey, some cheese, though it would not last long in the heat of a late summer Atlantic crossing, and fresh water, the most precious cargo of all, stored in wooden casks that slowly took on the flavour of the wood and the organisms growing inside them, developing over the weeks a taste that was somewhere between stale and alive, the taste of a container that has been sealed too long. The one hot meal of the day was cooked on the fogon, a sandbox mounted on the main deck, in which a fire could be lit when the weather permitted. When it did not permit, when the sea was rough or the wind too strong or the spray too constant, there was no hot food, just whatever could be eaten cold, washed down with water that tasted increasingly of the cask it had been sitting in for weeks. The men ate in shifts, crouched on the deck or sitting with their backs against the gunwale, using their knees as tables, eating with their hands or with whatever implement they had thought to bring. No ceremony, no comfort, just fuel, consumed in the most efficient way available, in the service of a voyage whose end remained invisible. Pedro de Terreros, Columbus's steward, was responsible for managing these provisions, rationing them carefully across the length of the voyage. His was a thankless task, too generous, and you ran out before landfall. Too strict, and the men muttered and sulked and worked badly. The balance was delicate, and the accounts preserved from later voyages suggest that provisioning disputes, arguments over rations, accusations of favoritism, suspicions that officers were eating better than ordinary seamen, were a constant source of tension on any long crossing. On this voyage, with no precedent to guide the rationing and no reliable estimate of how long the crossing would take, Terreros was working in the dark in more ways than one. On this voyage, the tension was amplified by uncertainty. No one knew how long the crossing would take, because no one had ever made it before. Every calculation was a guess. Every ration was allocated against an unknown timeline. And as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks began to accumulate, the question that no one wanted to ask out loud became harder and harder to suppress. How much longer? The ocean, meanwhile, was doing strange things. In the second week of September, the fleet sailed into what we now know as the Sargasso Sea, that vast, almost still region of the mid-Atlantic, bounded not by land, but by ocean currents, its surface choked with floating mats of golden brown sargassum seaweed. For sailors in 1492, this was deeply unsettling. The weeds stretched to every horizon, dense enough in places to slow the ships, strange enough in appearance to feed every fear about monsters and entrapments and the sea's capacity for treachery. The water beneath the weed was a different colour, darker, deeper, as if the seaweed were a lid on something that didn't want to be seen. The ships moved through it slowly, their hulls dragging against the floating masses, the sound of the weed against the planking a new and unfamiliar noise in the constant vocabulary of shipboard sounds. Columbus's journal records the crew's anxiety about the weed, but the depositions from the Platos Colombinos add texture to this anxiety that the official account smooths away. Several witnesses, speaking decades later, described a specific fear that circulated among the ordinary sailors, a fear that the weeds were the outer edge of a shallow sea, that beneath the golden surface lay hidden shoals and reefs, that the ships were sailing into a trap from which they could not reverse. Men who had spent their lives reading the ocean were suddenly in a part of it that behaved by different rules, and the unfamiliarity was, in its own quiet way, terrifying. The Sargasso Sea has no shores, no landmarks, no points of reference. It is a place defined entirely by what surrounds it rather than what it contains. To sail into it was to enter a geography that had no edges you could navigate by, only a vast, golden, drifting strangeness that seemed to go on forever. There was also the compass. Somewhere in mid-September, the pilots noticed that the compass needles were no longer pointing precisely north. They were deflecting slightly, what we now know as magnetic declination, the difference between magnetic north and true north, which varies depending on where on the Earth's surface you are. In 1492, no one had a reliable explanation for this phenomenon. Some pilots had encountered minor variations before, on voyages along the African coast, but nothing like this. The deflection was growing as they sailed west, and it was measurable, and it was consistent, and it had no explanation that anyone on those ships could offer with confidence. This was, in the private calculations of the pilots, alarming. The compass was the most fundamental navigational tool they had. If the compass couldn't be trusted, what could be? How do you navigate an unknown ocean when the instrument you rely on for direction has started behaving in ways you don't understand? The pilots would have kept this discovery quiet at first, checking and rechecking their readings, comparing observations, hoping the deflection would correct itself. When it didn't, when it continued to grow, the question of what to do with the information became urgent. Columbus had an explanation. He offered it to the pilots and, in a modified form, to the crew. He told them the compass wasn't malfunctioning. It was the North Star that was moving. The star itself was circling the pole, he suggested, and the compass was tracking the star. Therefore, the instrument was working correctly. It was the sky that was different out here. The rules of the familiar world didn't quite apply in this part of the ocean, but that was a property of the ocean, not a failure of the technology. This explanation was, to put it gently, incorrect, but it had the virtue of being unfalsifiable in the moment, and it had the further virtue of keeping the men calm. The compass, Columbus was saying, still works. The ocean is just different here. Everything is under control. We have an explanation. The explanation is wrong, but neither you nor I can prove that from the deck of a small ship in the middle of the Atlantic in 1492. And so, the explanation will serve. Whether the pilots believed him is another matter. The depositions suggest they didn't, entirely. But they accepted the explanation, or at least stopped pressing the point, which amounted to the same thing in practice. This was the unspoken contract of command on a voyage like this one. The officers had the right to ask questions, but at a certain point, the asking became destabilizing, and everyone understood that the voyage could not survive too much honest uncertainty expressed too loudly. The fear had to be managed. The compass anomaly was folded into the managed version of events, and the fleet sailed on. And so the fleet sailed on, deeper into the unknown, guided by instruments that were behaving strangely, provisioned for a journey whose length nobody could predict, commanded by a man who was managing the truth as carefully as he managed the sails. The birds came in early October. This detail appears in Columbus's journal, and it is corroborated by several of the later depositions. The sudden appearance of birds flying west in increasing numbers, land birds, not seabirds, birds that had no business being this far from any shore. Petrels and terns were expected out here. They ranged far from land, and their presence meant nothing about proximity to a coast. But these were different birds, small songbirds, warblers and finches, the kind of birds that live in trees and fields and don't venture far over open water. Their presence in growing flocks, flying steadily westward with the purposeful directness of creatures that know where they are going, was interpreted, correctly as it turned out, as a sign that land was close. Columbus changed course to follow them. This decision, to deviate from the due west heading he had maintained for weeks, to steer southwest in pursuit of birds, is one of the most consequential navigational choices in the history of exploration. It worked. The birds were heading toward the Bahamas, and by following them, Columbus avoided landfall on the Florida coast, which might have brought him into contact with the powerful Mississippian cultures of the North American interior, rather than the more accessible island communities he actually encountered. The entire subsequent history of European contact with the Americas pivoted on the flight path of a flock of small birds, and on the decision of one man to trust them. But the decision was not made in a vacuum, and the accounts of how it was made, who argued for it, who resisted, what was said in the private councils held on the Santa Maria's stern castle, reveal something important about the dynamics of command on that voyage. Martin Alonso Pinzon, captain of the Pinta, had been pushing for a course change for days. He had his own observations, his own instincts, his own reading of the signs around them. He was a more experienced Atlantic sailor than Columbus in some respects, a man who had spent years navigating the waters between Spain and the Canaries, who had made runs along the African coast, who understood the behavior of wind and current in the eastern Atlantic in a way that Columbus, whose experience was primarily in the Mediterranean and the Portuguese Atlantic, did not quite match. He had been vocal about his opinions throughout the voyage, sometimes in ways that Columbus found difficult to manage. The relationship between Columbus and Pinzon is one of the hidden dramas of the 1492 crossing, and it is one that the official record, Columbus's own account, tends to minimize, because acknowledging Pinzon's role and influence would complicate the story of Columbus as sole visionary, sole commander, sole author of the discovery. A discovery authored by two men is a less powerful myth than one authored by one. The monument requires a single figure pointing at the horizon. It cannot accommodate the argument about which direction to point, but the depositions from the Platos Columbinos tell a different story. Witness after witness, men who had sailed on those ships, or known men who had, described a voyage in which command was contested, in which Pinzon's authority was real, and sometimes exceeded Columbus's in the eyes of the ordinary crew, in which the two men argued and competed and occasionally undermined each other in ways that the official log carefully obscures. Pinzon, according to several witnesses, was the man the sailors actually trusted. He was local, he was known. He had recruited many of them personally, walking the taverns and docks of Palos and Moguer and Huelva, putting his own reputation on the line for this voyage, calling in favors and making promises, and lending his name, a name that meant something in those coastal communities, to an enterprise that many people thought was foolish at best and suicidal at worst. When Pinzon spoke, men listened in a way they didn't quite listen to the foreign Genoese commander, with the accent and the unshakable conviction and the two sets of numbers. This matters because of what happened in the first week of October, when the tension that had been building for weeks finally came to a head. The crew wanted to turn back. This is documented. It is not in dispute. What is in dispute, what the various accounts describe differently, and what the gap between the official log and the private depositions reveals most clearly, is how close the situation came to actual mutiny, and what exactly was said and agreed to in the conversations that prevented it. Columbus's own account, as preserved in the Las Casas abstract, describes the situation in relatively controlled terms. There was grumbling, there were complaints. Columbus addressed the men, reminded them of the potential rewards, appealed to their courage and their duty to the crown. and the matter was resolved. The fleet continued west. It is the account of a commander who handled a difficult situation with authority and wisdom, and who wishes you to know this. But the depositions tell a more complicated story. Several witnesses describe a confrontation, not a grumbling, but an ultimatum. Men gathered on the deck of the Santa Maria or in a meeting between the captains, and the message was direct. We have been at sea for more than 30 days. We have no idea where we are. The provisions are running low. The compass doesn't work properly. We have seen no land. We want to go home. This was not insubordination born of cowardice. These were experienced sailors making a rational calculation based on the evidence available to them. The evidence said, "We have gone far enough." The evidence said, "There may be nothing out here." The evidence said, "The risk of continuing now exceeds the potential reward." Columbus, according to some accounts, responded with a threat. He told the men that it was pointless to complain because he had come to find the Indies and he intended to continue until he had done so, and any man who attempted to prevent this would answer for it. This is the Columbus of legend, relentless, imperious, armored in conviction, the man who would not be moved. But other accounts suggest something more nuanced, something that reveals, in the gap between what was said officially and what was remembered privately, the actual mechanism by which the voyage survived. There was a negotiation. Columbus, according to several of the Platos depositions, made a promise. He told the crew that if they did not sight land within 3 days, some accounts say 2 days, some say 3, he would turn the fleet around and sail back to Spain. This promise is not in Columbus's own log. It is absent from the official record. It appears only in the private testimonies of men who were there, or who heard from men who were there, and who remembered it decades later when they were called to give sworn evidence in a legal dispute. It survived not because anyone thought it was important, but because it was the kind of thing a frightened man remembers. The moment when the person in charge admitted, however obliquely, that there were limits, that the voyage was not infinite, that there was a point beyond which even Columbus would turn back. Whether Columbus made this promise intending to keep it, or whether it was a calculated gamble, a way of buying time, knowing that the signs of land were accumulating and that 3 more days would likely be enough, is something we cannot know. What we know is that he made it, and we know it because the men who heard it remembered it and carried it with them for the rest of their lives, and brought it out again when the lawyers came asking. I want to pause here and ask you something. The archive is full of stories like this one, moments where the private memory of ordinary people contradicts the official record. Are there other hidden histories that keep you awake? Other places where you've sensed the gap between the monument and the margin? Drop it in the comments. I want to know what the archive looks like from where you're standing. 3 days later, on the night of October 11th, going into October 12th, the watch on the Pinta saw a light, a distant flickering on the western horizon. Not a star, not phosphorescence. A light that moved and then was still, and then moved again, as if someone was carrying a torch on a dark shore. It was small and it was uncertain, and a less experienced or less desperate eye might have dismissed it as a trick of the night. But Rodrigo de Triana had been at sea for weeks, and he knew what he was looking for, and he knew what he saw, and he called out the words that every man on every ship had been waiting to hear since the day they left Palus. Land. Land ahead. Columbus would later claim to have seen this light first, before the lookout on the Pinta. He claimed this because there was a reward, a lifetime pension from the Spanish crown, promised to the first man to sight land. Rodrigo de Triana, the sailor on the Pinta's watch who actually saw the light and called out the cry that has echoed through history, never received that pension. Columbus claimed the sighting for himself, noting in his log that he had seen a light the previous evening. A light that, conveniently, only he had noticed. A light that the men around him had somehow missed. A light that appeared in the record only after the question of who deserved the reward had become relevant. This detail, small, petty, almost embarrassing in its smallness, appears in the depositions with a kind of quiet outrage. Men who had been there, or who had heard the story from men who had, remembered it and resented it. Rodrigo de Triana had seen the light. Rodrigo de Triana had shouted the words, and the man in the stern castle had taken the credit and the money. The official record says Columbus saw it first. The Sailor's Archive says otherwise, and it says so in the voices of men who had no reason to lie about it. Men who were testifying under oath decades later about a moment they had not forgotten and apparently could not quite forgive. At dawn on October the 12th, 1492, the fleet dropped anchor off a low, green island in what we now call the Bahamas. Columbus named it San Salvador. The people who lived there, the Taino, a branch of the Arawakan peoples who had inhabited these islands for centuries, came out in canoes to look at the strange ships. They came without weapons, without apparent fear, with what the accounts describe as open curiosity, paddling around the hulls, looking up at the rigging, reaching out to touch the wood of the gunwales with their hands. What happened next is recorded in Columbus's journal in language that is both vivid and, to a modern reader, deeply uncomfortable. He describes the Taino people in terms of their potential usefulness, their apparent gentleness, their lack of weapons, their susceptibility to conversion, their bodies, which he notes would make good servants. Within hours of arriving on an island he had never seen, in a world he did not recognize, Columbus was already calculating how it could be exploited. The language of discovery and the language of possession were, in Columbus's mind, the same language. But the sailors saw something different. The depositions and the fragments of private testimony from this period describe the first encounter with the Taino in terms that are, in some cases, more human and more complicated than the official account. Men who had been terrified for weeks, who had eaten bad food and slept on wet planking and watched the compass drift and wondered if they were going to die, suddenly found themselves on a warm island beach surrounded by people who were, by all accounts, curious and welcoming. The relief of it, the sheer physical relief of solid ground and fresh water, and the end of the fear, seems to have opened something in some of the men, something that the official record focused on possession and profit didn't quite have room for. There are fragments of testimony describing ordinary sailors trading with the Taino, exchanging small objects, bells, glass beads, bits of broken crockery, for food and water and the simple pleasure of human contact after weeks of ocean. There are descriptions of men sitting on the beach and eating fresh fruit for the first time in more than a month, and the way that tasted, the sweetness of it, the moisture of it, the overwhelming contrast with the hardtack, and salt fish that had been their diet for 33 days. There are observations, careful and sometimes wondering, of the Taino's houses, their tools, their boats, their way of life. Observations made not from the perspective of a conqueror calculating resources, but from the perspective of a sailor who had been afraid for a very long time and was now, unexpectedly, somewhere extraordinary. These fragments matter. They matter because they remind us that the 90 men on those ships were not a monolith. They were not all Columbus. They did not all see the same thing when they looked at the islands and the people and the impossible green world they had found. Some of them saw what Columbus saw: opportunity, wealth, a transaction to be completed. But some of them saw something else, something that didn't fit neatly into the categories of discovery and conquest and royal investment. Something that made them pause and look more carefully and reach for words that their vocabulary didn't quite contain. And some of them wrote it down. The question of what the sailors actually thought, not what they were supposed to think, not what the official record says they thought, but what they privately felt and recorded and carried home in their memories, is the deepest question in the art archive of this voyage. It is the question that the depositions circle around without quite answering, the question that the margins of the official documents hint at without resolving. Consider what it means to be one of those men. You are a fisherman from Palos, or a rope maker from Huelva, or a carpenter's apprentice from Moga. You have spent your whole life in a world that has a shape you understand. The coastline of Andalusia, the familiar waters of the Atlantic approaches, the rhythms of tide and season that your father taught you and his father taught him. You know where the edge of the known world is, because you grew up looking at it from the beach. It was a real edge, not metaphorical, a line past which no one you knew had ever gone and returned. It was the boundary of the world, and you have lived your whole life in the comfortable certainty of its presence. And then, in the space of 33 days, you cross it. You arrive somewhere that is not on any map, that has no name in any language you know, that is populated by people whose existence your entire cultural framework has no category for. And you are asked, by your commander, by the crown, by the logic of the enterprise you signed on for, to process this experience in terms of profit and loss, discovery and possession, the cross and the flag and the deed of claim. But you are also a human being, and human beings, when they encounter the genuinely new, do not always process it in the terms they were given. The sailors' accounts, fragmentary, filtered, preserved only in the margins and the depositions and the second-hand recollections, suggest that some of the men on those ships were genuinely disoriented by what they found, not in a frightening way, but in the way that genuine encounter with the new is always disorienting. The world was larger than they had been told. The people they found were not what they expected. The experience of crossing the ocean and arriving somewhere real, not the edge of an abyss, not the realm of sea monsters, but an actual place with actual people and fresh water and birds singing in trees, had changed something in them, something that they couldn't quite name and couldn't quite put back the way it had been before. There is a deposition from the Platos Colombinos, given by a man named Juan Rodriguez Bermejo, who may or may not be the same person as Rodrigo de Triana. The naming conventions of the period being somewhat fluid, in which he describes the moment of landfall in terms that are striking for their simplicity. He doesn't describe glory or triumph or the fulfillment of a great mission. He describes the sound of birds in the dark, the smell of land coming off the island before they could see it, the way the air changed, becoming warmer and softer, carrying something green and alive that the open ocean had not had. He describes standing on the deck in the hour before dawn and knowing, before he could see anything, that the crossing was over. That is the sailor's archive. That is the version of history that was almost lost. Not the monument, the smell of land in the dark. The return voyage is less celebrated than the outward crossing, but in some ways it is more revealing. It is the part of the story where the careful management of the official record shows its seams most clearly, where the gap between what Columbus wrote and what the sailors remembered becomes widest and most instructive. Columbus left the island of Hispaniola in January 1493, leaving behind a small garrison of men at a fort he called La Navidad, the first European settlement in the Americas, built from the timbers of the Santa Maria, which had run aground on Christmas Eve and could not be salvaged. The grounding of the flagship was itself a story the official record handles carefully. Columbus's log attributes it to the negligence of a helmsman, a convenient explanation that places the blame on an ordinary sailor rather than on any failure of command. The men who were there had their own opinions about this, and some of those opinions appear obliquely in the depositions. But the grounding is a story for another night. The return crossing was faster, the trade winds and the westerlies cooperated in a way that the outward voyage had not. But it was also more dangerous. In February 1493, the fleet ran into a severe storm somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. The kind of storm that makes a 15-meter wooden ship feel like a leaf on a river. The kind of storm that strips away every comfortable illusion about the scale of human beings relative to the scale of the ocean, and leaves you with nothing but the bare fact of your own smallness and the very immediate question of whether you are going to survive the next hour. Columbus's journal describes the storm in terms of personal crisis. He was afraid he would die before he could deliver the news of his discovery to the Spanish court. He was afraid the knowledge would be lost, that the world would never know what he had found. He wrote a summary of the voyage on parchment, sealed it in a waxed cloth, and placed it in a cask and threw it into the sea. A message in a bottle, essentially, addressed to the King and Queen of Spain, cast into the Atlantic on the chance that it might survive even if the ship did not. It is a remarkable act and a revealing one. In the middle of a life-threatening storm, Columbus's primary concern was not his own survival, but the survival of his legacy. Not his body, but his record. The cask has never been found, but the sailors' accounts of that storm, preserved in the depositions, in the letters of men who survived it and wanted to describe what they had experienced, tell a different story of the same event. Where Columbus's account is focused on the fate of his discovery, his legacy, his place in history, the sailors' accounts are focused on the immediate physical reality of the storm itself. The height of the waves, the sound of the rigging in the wind, a sound several witnesses describe as something between a scream and a roar. A sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once and from nowhere at all. Not the sound of wind through ropes, but something larger and less identifiable, as if the ocean itself were making a noise. The way the ship moved, Not the gentle rise and fall of an ordinary swell, but a violent, unpredictable lurching, the bow dropping into a trough and the stern rising so steeply that men had to grip anything fixed to keep from sliding into the sea. Men prayed. Men made vows. Men promised specific things to specific saints in exchange for survival. A pilgrimage to this shrine, a candle of this weight, a mass said at this church, the specific, contractual piety of people who are genuinely afraid they are about to die. Several witnesses in the depositions describe making these vows and, after the storm passed, feeling the strange mixture of relief and obligation that comes with having bargained with the divine and won. The vows were kept by the accounts we have. Men made pilgrimages. Men bought candles. The saints had held up their end of the bargain, and ordinary sailors from Pallas and Moguer honoured their debts with the same practical seriousness they brought to every other transaction in their lives. One account, preserved in a fragment that scholars have attributed to a sailor from Palos, whose full name is lost, but who signed his testimony with a mark rather than a signature, describes the moment the storm broke in language, that is, even in translation, quietly extraordinary. He describes the clouds parting and the stars appearing, one by one, in a sky that had been solid black for 2 days. He describes the way the sea gradually calmed, the waves losing their violence and settling into a long, rolling swell that still lifted the ship, but no longer threatened to consume it. He describes the sound of men weeping, not from grief, but from relief, the involuntary weeping of bodies that have been afraid for a very long time and have suddenly been allowed to stop. The specific physical release of fear that has been held too long. And he describes Columbus standing at the stern in the first light after the storm, looking west toward the islands they had left behind and then east towards Spain, and not moving for a very long time. The sailor doesn't tell us what Columbus was thinking. He doesn't speculate. He just describes what he saw. A man standing very still at the stern of a small ship in a calming sea, looking in both directions, as if he wasn't quite sure which way to face, as if the crossing had put him in a place between two worlds, and the storm had stripped away whatever certainty had previously told him which one he belonged to. That image, Columbus between two worlds, between what he had found and what he was returning to, uncertain which direction held his future, is not in the official record. It is in the margin. It is in the testimony of a man who couldn't write his own name, but who had eyes and memory and the human impulse to record what he had witnessed. It survived because a lawyer needed it. It matters because it is true. It is perhaps the truest portrait of Columbus that exists. What other figures do you think history has only given us the official portrait of? Commanders, kings, explorers, where the real story is waiting somewhere in the margins? I'd love to know who the archive is still keeping quiet for you. The fleet arrived at Lisbon in early March 1493 and at Palos on the 15th of March. The same harbour they had left 7.5 months before. The same salt and mud and tar smell. The same wooden piers with torchlight reflecting off dark water. The same estuary of the Rio Tinto. The same silhouette of the church of San Jorge on the hill above the town. The same sounds of a harbour settling into its evening rhythms. But everything else was different. The men who came home were not the same men who had left. This is not a metaphor. This is a literal, physical, psychological fact that the depositions and the private accounts circle around with a kind of careful attention, as if the witnesses are trying to describe something they don't quite have words for. The voyage had done something to them, not in the dramatic, transformative way that stories like to describe, not a sudden enlightenment or a clean conversion from one way of seeing the world to another. Something slower and more permanent. The way that any experience that genuinely exceeds your previous understanding of what is possible changes the shape of your thinking from the inside, quietly and without announcement, so that you only notice it later when you try to fit your old assumptions back over a mind that has grown past them. They had crossed an ocean that no European had crossed before and returned alive. They had found land on the other side. They had encountered people whose existence the entire framework of European knowledge had not anticipated. They had been afraid, genuinely afraid, for weeks at a time, and they had survived. They had made promises to saints in the middle of storms, and they had to go now and keep those promises, because the saints had held up their end of the bargain. And they had secrets, things they had seen and heard and done, that the official record did not contain. Things that were complicated or inconvenient, or simply too private for the log of a royal expedition. Things that they would carry for the rest of their lives, bringing them out occasionally in taverns or in church, or in the quiet of their own minds, turning them over and examining them in the way that people examine experiences that changed them. The smell of land in the dark before the island was visible, the sound of birds flying west in the night, the 3-day promise that Columbus made and the official log forgot, the light on the horizon that Rodrigo de Triana saw first and Columbus claimed for himself. These were the things the sailors carried home. These were the contents of the archive that history almost lost. The Pleitos Colombinos, those decades-long legal disputes that gave us so many of the sailors' testimonies, were primarily about money. Columbus's heirs claimed that the terms of the original agreement between Columbus and the Spanish crown had been violated, that the family had been cheated of the titles and revenues they were owed. The crown argued otherwise. Witnesses were called. Depositions were taken. Old men were asked to remember what they had seen and heard in 1492 and in the years that followed. And in the process of arguing about money, they told us everything else. They told us about the 2 sets of numbers and the managed truth. They told us about the negotiation before the near mutiny, the 3-day promise that Columbus made and the official log forgot. They told us about Rodrigo de Triana and the light on the horizon and the pension that went to the wrong man. They told us about Pinzon and the contested command and the relationship between the local hero and the foreign visionary that the official record compressed into a simple hierarchy. They told us about the storm and the prayers and the weeping and the man standing still at the stern between 2 worlds. They told us, in other words, what it was actually like, not the history book version, not the myth or the mural or the marble statue, the actual physical, moment-by-moment experience of 90 human beings doing something that had never been done before, in conditions that were difficult and frightening and sometimes beautiful, for reasons that were complicated and various, and not always the reasons the official record assigned them. This is what the Sailor's Archive contains. This is what history almost lost. Consider what it means that we have it at all. The Platos Colombinos generated thousands of pages of testimony. Much of it was preserved because it was legally significant, because lawyers needed it, because the crown needed it, because money was at stake and documents were kept. The sailors' voices survived not because anyone thought their private experiences were worth preserving, but because their memories happened to be useful in a property dispute. This is how most of history's hidden archives survive. Not because someone decided they were important, because they were incidentally preserved, tucked into the margins of official documents, embedded in legal testimony, recorded in the notebooks of people who were trying to accomplish something else entirely. The sailors didn't know they were leaving a record. They were just answering questions. They were just trying to remember what had happened as accurately as they could in the service of an argument about inheritance. And in doing so, they gave us something that the official record, carefully managed and politically shaped from the very beginning, could not give us. They gave us the truth of the experience, not the meaning, not the interpretation, not the place in history, just the truth of what it felt like to be there, in those small wooden ships, crossing that impossible ocean, arriving at that impossible shore, the smell of land in the dark, the stars appearing one by one after the storm, a man standing still at the stern between two worlds. There is a deeper question underneath all of this, and it is the question that the Sailor's Archive, in its fragmentary and accidental way, keeps pushing us toward. What do we lose when we lose the ordinary voices? Every historical event of significance is surrounded by a penumbra of private experience, the thoughts and feelings and observations of the people who were present but not in command, not in the official record, not the subject of the monuments and the textbooks, the servants and the soldiers, the sailors and the scribes, the women who are almost entirely absent from the record of 14.2, the indigenous people whose own accounts of the encounter survive only in fragments and in the oral traditions that European colonization tried its best to erase. All of these voices carry something that the official record cannot carry, because the official record is always, by its nature, a managed version of events. It is always shaped by the needs of the people who have the power to shape it, the crown, the church, the commanders, the men who had something to gain or lose from how the story was told. The Taino people of the Bahamas and Hispaniola had their own account of the encounter. They had their own memory of the ships appearing on the horizon, the strange men who came ashore, the objects exchanged, the words that couldn't be translated. That account survives only in fragments, in the observations of Spanish missionaries who recorded Taino oral traditions before those traditions were disrupted, in the archaeological record, in the linguistic traces that remain in the languages of their descendants. It is an account that the official record of 1492 had no interest in preserving, and every interest in overwriting. And yet, it is part of the same event. It is the other side of the same moment that Columbus recorded in his log and Rodrigo de Triana witnessed from the bow of the Pinta. The sailors' voices are different, not because they are more objective. They are not. Every witness has a perspective, an interest, a reason for remembering things a certain way, but they are different because they are closer to the ground. They are closer to the physical reality of the experience. They are less invested in the meaning and more invested in the fact. They remember the smell and the sound and the fear and the relief. because those are the things that happen to a body. And bodies don't have agendas. A body remembers the taste of fresh fruit after 33 days of hardtack. A body remembers the sound of the rigging in a storm. A body remembers the moment the fear stopped and the weeping began. This is what the archive contains when you go deep enough into it. Not the grand narrative, not the interpretive framework, not the meaning that history assigns in retrospect to events that, as they were happening, had no guaranteed meaning at all. Just the experience, just the fact of being there. And that, perhaps, is the most valuable thing history can preserve. We keep looking for the captain's log. We keep looking for the official record, the authoritative account, the version that comes with credentials and royal backing and a place in the textbook. And those things matter. They contain real information. They preserve real knowledge. They give us the shape of events, the sequence, the geography, the names and dates and decisions that allow us to construct a coherent picture of what happened. But the sailor's archive, the margins, the depositions, the private testimonies, the accounts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things and trying to describe what it was like, contains something that the official record cannot contain. It contains the irreducible human experience of the event, the way the hardtack tasted after 3 weeks at sea, the sound of the rigging in a mid-Atlantic storm, the smell of land before you can see it, the involuntary weeping of relief, a man standing still at the stern between two worlds. These things are not in the official log. They are not in the history books. They are in the margins, waiting to be found by someone who looks carefully enough and waits quietly enough to hear them. They are in the depositions of old men who couldn't always remember the dates, but never forgot the sensations. They are in the fragments signed with marks rather than names, in the corrections penciled into the margins of official documents, in the small rebellions of people who wanted the record to be accurate, even when accuracy was inconvenient. That is what the archive is for. That is why we come here in the quiet hours, when the noise of the daylight world has faded and the mind is open to the things that don't fit neatly into the official version of events. The sailors of the Nina, the Pinta and the Santa Maria crossed an ocean and arrived somewhere impossible and came home changed, carrying secrets they would spend the rest of their lives trying to articulate. Some of those secrets survived. Some were lost. Some are still waiting in the margins of documents that no one has looked at carefully enough yet, in the gaps between the official record and the private truth, in the space between what history says happened and what it actually felt like to be there. The archive is never fully closed. The documents are never fully translated. The sailors are never fully silent. Somewhere in the dust of a Spanish archive, in the faded ink of a deposition taken 400 years ago, a man who couldn't write his own name is still describing the stars appearing one by one after the storm, still describing the smell of land in the dark, still standing on the deck of a small wooden ship in the mid-Atlantic, listening to the ocean, waiting for the horizon to change. He is still there. We just have to be quiet enough to hear him. And now, as the archive settles into its nightly stillness, as the files close one by one and the lamplight dims over the old documents, let the weight of all of that history rest gently on you. Let the ocean sounds fade. Let the creak of timber and rope grow distant. Let the voices of 90 sailors who crossed the impossible and came home changed dissolve into the particular quiet of wherever you are right now. The crossing is over. The storm has passed. The stars are coming out. You can rest now. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, share it with someone who might need it tonight. A friend who loves the stories that didn't make it into the textbooks. Someone who lies awake, wondering about the gaps in what we were told. When you pass this along, you're doing what the Sailor's Archive has always depended on. One person remembering, one person telling another. The hidden record surviving because ordinary people decided it was worth preserving. And if the layers of this one haven't fully settled yet, let it play again on a quiet night. The margins reveal themselves differently each time. If you found something worth holding in tonight's exploration, leave a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. Tell me what you're thinking about. The archive is always open, and I read everything. Until next time, may your path through history's deepest mysteries be illuminated by curiosity, and may the secrets that history tried to hide find their way, gently and slowly, into the light. The sailors are still out there, somewhere in the dark water between what was known and what was found. They kept their secrets for 500 years. Tonight, for a little while, we kept them together. There is another place where the official record ends and the hidden truth begins, beneath the most iconic monument in the world, where Egypt has spent decades controlling what gets excavated, what gets measured, and what gets explained. What lies under the Sphinx, and why won't they let you see it? That archive is waiting for you next.